3 years. That's how long Ashley Cooper had been invisible at Oak Creek Memorial in Portland, and she'd perfected the art of it. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as she moved through the ER corridors at 0300 hours, her scrubs wrinkled at the edges just enough to signal she was nobody important, her badge clipped low where it wouldn't catch anyone's attention. Nobody looked at the floor nurse who didn't speak unless spoken to. Nobody asked questions about the scars on her knuckles, thin white lines that ran like old topographic maps across the backs of her hands. 3 years of being unremarkable, and she'd built a reputation solid enough to be forgotten completely. The antiseptic smell hit her first, that sharp chemical bite that smelled like safety to most people but smelled like memory to Ashley. 20 years of muscle memory, actually. The kind you don't shake by moving to a different city or wearing a different uniform or telling yourself you were someone else now. The ER bay was chaos at this hour, controlled chaos, the kind that looked like confusion to civilians but looked like rhythm to people who'd learned medicine in places where the power cut out and you worked by flashlight and prayer. She grabbed a chart from the intake nurse, scanning vitals automatically, moving with the kind of efficiency that drew zero attention because it looked entirely normal. That's when she saw him. The backboard came through the trauma bay doors at 0327 hours, and everything in Ashley's chest ceased for exactly one breath. The patient was male, mid-30s, bleeding from a wound on his left anterior chest that had already soaked through the field dressing. No wallet on the gurney. No ID bracelet. No family standing over him screaming. Just a body and questions and the particular sound of trauma that Ashley's hands recognized before her mind caught up, the way certain wounds moved, certain chest compressions, the specific trajectory of blood that meant penetrating injury and not blunt force. She moved toward the bay without thinking about it. Unidentified male, found 3 blocks from the waterfront, the paramedic called out, hands already moving to transfer the patient onto the trauma table. Vitals were unstable in the ambulance, dropped to 80 systolic en route, no response to initial fluids. The shirt came off with practice speed, and Ashley was already moving closer, her eyes cataloguing the wound site with a kind of precision that came from having done this before, a long time ago, in a place that wasn't Portland, Oregon. The bullet or shrapnel had entered at the 4th intercostal space, left of the midline, and the way the tissue was disrupted, the specific pattern of the wound tract, she could see it. She could read it like a map. Her hands touched his jacket, still bundled on the gurney beside him, and that's when she felt it. Cold metal. Small. Warm from being against his skin. The dog tag on a broken chain was barely visible, threaded through a buttonhole in the fabric, and she had to lean in to read it. J. A. Martinez. 3 letters and a name and 20 years compressed into a single moment that made her fingers go very still against the fabric. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what made her breath catch in a way she absolutely could not let anyone see. Pinned inside the torn jacket lining, metal side out, was a Ranger Tab combat badge. Army Ranger. 75th Regiment patch visible even through the torn fabric. And the way it was positioned, sewn into the jacket lining with deliberate care, meant this man had been carrying it for years. Hidden. The way people carried things that mattered. The way people carried secrets. Ashley's fingers trembled against the metal for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds of muscle memory that lived in her hands, in her bones, in the part of her that had never actually left Sanjin province. 2 seconds of recognition and 20 years compressed into the weight of a single badge. Then she steadied herself, feeling the tremor quiet, feeling the major in her push back down where she kept her locked, where she kept the part of herself that had seen things and done things that didn't exist in her current life because officially, that life had never happened. She stepped back from the gurney. Around her, the ER was moving with its own momentum, nurses and residents calling for supplies, the crash cart being positioned, someone already checking for a second line. Ashley folded the jacket, careful and precise, and moved it to the chair beside the trauma bay. She could do this. She could be a floor nurse assessing a patient and nothing more. She could be someone who simply happened to notice things. She could push the badge down into the back of her mind and focus on vitals and oxygen and the things that floor nurses were supposed to worry about. But her eyes kept moving back to the wound site. Type and cross, stat, one of the residents called out, already moving to examine the chest. Ashley was already reaching for the trauma shears, cutting away the remaining fabric, and her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, someone with 18 months of embedded deployment experience, someone who'd learned to read penetrating thoracic trauma in conditions where you had 30 seconds to decide between surgery and prayer. She wasn't supposed to be doing anything but handing instruments. She wasn't supposed to know what she was looking at. She definitely wasn't supposed to be the one noting the secondary entry point, the small puncture wound near the first injury that most people would miss. There, she said quietly, and it took her a moment to realize she'd spoken at all. Her finger pointed to the second wound site, barely visible through the blood and tissue. Secondary trauma. Subclavian region. Probably pneumothorax. The resident turned to look at her, surprised that a floor nurse had spoken. Surprised that a floor nurse knew the word. Surprised that a floor nurse was reading a trauma pattern with the kind of certainty that came from having seen it before, having seen it in a place called Sanjin province in a country where the dust got into everything and the sound of incoming fire sounded like nothing else on earth. That's when Dr. Marcus Ashford walked in. He was the kind of man who moved like his white coat was a uniform, like the corridor had been cleared for him even when it hadn't. Tall, sharp-featured, with the particular assurance that came from having never questioned whether he belonged. 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial and Ashley had learned to read his movements the way she'd learned to read a trauma site. He was a man who noticed things, especially things that challenged his authority, and right now he was noticing a floor nurse with scarred hands hovering too long over a patient's chart, asking questions that should have been answered by residents. His eyes moved from the patient to Ashley, and his jaw tightened in a way that was barely visible but was visible if you'd spent 20 years learning to read threat assessment. "I'll take it from here," he said, and the words were polite but they weren't a request. It was the kind of tone that expected movement, compliance, the understanding that hierarchy had a structure and floor nurses existed below the line where decisions happened. He was already moving toward the trauma bay, already inserting himself into the space where Ashley had been standing, already establishing the physical distance that meant she was supposed to leave. Ashley stepped back. That was the job. That was the invisible part. That was the part that kept you safe, that kept your head down, that meant nobody asked too many questions about why a floor nurse's hands moved with the precision of someone who'd held lives together in places where the backup power was a diesel generator and the anesthesia came in 2 varieties, what they had and what they didn't. "Get me 2 units already typed," Ashford called out, his eyes moving over the patient with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen this before. His hands were steady, his movements efficient, and Ashley recognized the competence because she understood competence. But she also recognized the moment his eyes caught on the secondary wound site, the moment his jaw shifted slightly when he realized this patient had trauma patterns that required a specific kind of knowledge to identify. The moment he looked back at the trauma shears in her hands. She set them down on the instrument tray. She didn't meet his eyes. She did exactly what floor nurses did. She moved toward the medication cabinet to prepare what would be ordered. She kept her hand steady. She let the tremor that lived in her chest stay exactly where tremors were supposed to stay, which was nowhere visible. But her hands remembered. Her hands remembered Sanjin province. Her hands remembered the weight of a child named Juanito Martinez who'd been screaming, and then who hadn't been screaming anymore because of something she'd done, something she'd sewn into his jacket before he was evacuated. Something that was now lying in a destroyed uniform in the trauma bay of a hospital in Portland, Oregon, in a different life that she wasn't supposed to remember. Dr. Ashford was already issuing orders, his voice taking on the particular tone of someone who was now in charge, who had made the assessment, who would determine the next steps. He glanced back once, his eyes lingering on Ashley's hands for a moment longer than necessary, and she felt the precise weight of his attention like a scope sight. Like recognition. Like the moment before everything changes. She was already moving toward the 4 cart, already preparing for what would come next, already pushing the badge and the name and the 20 years back down into the part of her that didn't exist officially, that had never existed in any capacity that could be verified or documented or explained. Around her, the ER moved like a living organism, footsteps on tile, the beep of monitors, the soft hiss of oxygen flowing through tubes, the particular sound of a trauma bay in motion. But underneath all of it, Ashley heard something else. She heard the clock starting. She heard the moment beginning to unravel, slowly at first, the way threads do when someone pulls on them even a little bit. She heard the question forming in Dr. Ashford's eyes, the question about a floor nurse who knew too much, who moved too precisely, who carried secrets in her hands. What she didn't know was that 24 hours from now, everything would accelerate. The ICU room smelled like antiseptic and fear when Martinez's family arrived. His mother first, Elena, 63, her face a map of every worry she'd ever carried. 2 younger adults followed, a man and woman who had to be siblings, their eyes locked on the monitor's steady beeping like it was a prayer they could keep him alive through sheer force of attention. Ashley stood at the bedside, her hand resting on the fall line, explaining in her careful, measured voice, his oxygen saturation is stable. 94%. The thoracic injury is significant, but we've got him on pain management every 4 hours, and his vitals are responding well too. The door opened like a statement. Dr. Marcus Ashford entered the room with the presence that made air pressure change, his white coat crisp as a threat, his eyes finding Ashley and narrowing with the precision of someone who'd already decided what he was going to say. He didn't greet the family. He didn't acknowledge Martinez. He moved between Ashley and the bedside with the casual authority of a man who'd never been asked to move aside, and his voice when it came was sharp enough to cut. "Nurse Cooper, I'll handle patient communication from this point forward." He didn't look at her. "You're not qualified to interpret thoracic trauma assessment." Ashley opened her mouth. The words formed on her tongue, a dozen explanations, a careful defense, but she'd learned this dance 3 years ago at Oak Creek Memorial. She took one measured breath through her nose. "Doctor, I was simply explaining his current vitals and this is exactly the problem." Ashford's voice rose half an octave, pitched to the family now, performing for witnesses. "This is what I've been concerned about. You overstep. Consistently. You lack appropriate deference for the chain of command. These good people deserve to hear from an actual physician, not a floor nurse with enthusiastic ideas about her own expertise." Martinez's mother's hand tightened on the bed rail. The woman, his sister, maybe, exchanged a glance with her brother that said they'd never seen anything like this, that something about this doctor felt wrong but they didn't have the language for it yet. Elena reached across the gap, her eyes finding Ashley's with a question in them. "The pain medication, is it enough? He keeps saying his chest." Ashford stepped between them. Deliberately. His body became a wall. "Mrs. Martinez, please direct medical questions to actual physicians. Nurse Cooper has enthusiastic ideas about her expertise, but she's not equipped to make clinical assessments." There it was. The thing that landed different than the others. Ashley felt something shift behind her ribs. Not rage. Not fear. Something colder. Something that remembered desert heat and dust in blood and the sound of children screaming. She could feel the tears forming before her mind caught up to the trigger, felt one escape down her left cheek, and she did what she'd learned to do 20 years ago. She didn't hide it, didn't apologize for it, didn't let it break her voice. She wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact with Ashford, and when she spoke, it came out steady as a surgeon's hand over an open chest. "Of course, doctor. I'll return to my station." She walked past him. Didn't rush. Didn't look back. Could feel his satisfaction radiating behind her like heat off asphalt. For hours later, the unit assignment board in the main nursing station became a public execution. The paper was printed in Ashford's precise handwriting, posted at eye level where every nurse who clocked in would see it. The words seemed to glow with their own authority. Cooper, A. Written warning for unauthorized patient assessment and inappropriate communication with patient family. Failure to respect established chain of command. The room went dead silent when Ashley arrived to read it. Nurses gathered in small clusters, their eyes cutting to her then away, conversations dropping into whispers. Someone said it quiet enough that it was meant to be heard, playing Florence Nightingale now, is she? Another voice, lower, Ashford doesn't like nurses who think they can think. The break room emptied like a toxic spill when she walked in at lunch. She watched it happen, the small exodus, colleagues suddenly remembering urgent tasks, urgent calls, urgent reasons to be anywhere else. A half-full coffee mug sat steaming on the table, abandoned so fast it had to be fresh. Someone's lunch bag left behind. They'd scattered like she carried something contagious. Ashley sat at the table alone, her meal, a sandwich she'd made that morning, untouched. The chair across from her stayed empty. The one next to her stayed empty. She ate methodically, chewed carefully, washed her hands with the same precision she used for everything, and didn't look at anyone when she left. The surgical prep corridor was empty at 1,700 hours. This was Ashley's mistake, choosing to confront him now, thinking she could corner him while the department was still. Ashford was reviewing a chart, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, and he looked almost human until he saw her coming. "Dr. Ashford." Her voice was level. "I need to understand why you're documenting my clinical assessments as unauthorized." I identified a specific injury pattern that. He removed his glasses. Slowly. Set them on the chart with deliberate care. The smile that crossed his face was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for permission to hurt someone and had just received it. "You want to understand, Nurse Cooper." He stood, and he was tall, and the corridor suddenly felt smaller. "Let me explain. You're too confident. Too questioning of medical hierarchy. You challenge decisions that don't need to be challenged. You threaten the careful structure that keeps this department functioning. Nurses who don't know their place, who don't understand that the foundation of hospital safety is respect for the chain of command, nurses like that create dangerous situations." He stepped closer. Not threatening, exactly. Just present. Just making sure she understood the physics of the room had changed. Ashley noticed his hands didn't shake. His conviction was absolute. He believed every word. "I know battlefield trauma patterns because I studied them," she said quietly. Because you watch too much TV." He laughed, sharp and dismissive, like the sound a razor makes against bone. "Because you're playing soldier, little corporal? That ranger doesn't need your fantasies. He needs my surgical expertise, not some delusional floor nurse cosplaying as a combat medic." The nickname landed exactly where he'd aimed it. Little corporal. As if her rank had been nothing. As if her years had meant nothing. As if the lives she'd held together in the dark counted for less than the title on his ID badge. Ashley took one measured breath. She let one tear escape without permission, without warning, let it track down her cheek while her eyes stayed locked on his, unflinching and cold as a gun barrel. When she wiped it away with the back of her hand, the gesture was almost contemptuous. "That ranger in Bedford has a sucking chest wound consistent with Sanjin Province IED patterns. If you'd served, you'd know the difference between shrapnel and a car accident." The corridor went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming above them, that high-pitched electronic drone that only existed in the silence after someone said something that couldn't be unsaid. Ashford's smile vanished. His jaw tightened. His hand closed into a fist against his thigh. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into a register she'd never heard from him before, not angry, exactly, but something darker. Something that understood, suddenly, that he was standing next to someone whose competence wasn't just professional. It was automatic. It was memory in muscle and bone. "My office," he said quietly. "Tomorrow morning at 0700. Prepare for a performance review." But that wasn't what changed everything. What happened next didn't wait for morning appointments. At 0200 hours, 14 minutes into the night shift, Martinez's oxygen saturation plummeted from 94% to 88 to 76. The ventilator alarm screamed its electronic shriek. His neck veins distended, visible ropes of pressure. The trachea shifted, you could see it under the skin, the subtle deviation that meant pressure building in places it shouldn't be building. Tension pneumothorax. The missed secondary puncture that Ashford's team had overlooked during their initial assessment. Ashley was at his bedside in 2 steps. The on-call resident was 12 minutes away. The code team was 8 minutes away. Martinez had 4 minutes before cardiac arrest, maybe 5 if luck was something that actually existed, and it didn't, and Ashley had known that since Sanjin. Her hands moved before her mind finished thinking. The trauma shears came from her pocket. She always carried them, just like she always kept an old habit in her locker that civilians didn't understand. The MRE packaging, vacuum-sealed, exactly the kind of thing a person kept if they'd spent 2 decades waiting for an emergency that didn't make sense in Portland, Oregon, but made perfect sense in the dark. She cut his gown away. Tore the MRE wrapper open with her teeth. The plastic was rough against her incisors, familiar in a way that made her hands move like they had muscle memory for this exact moment, this exact angle. The needle went in at the second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Textbook field medicine, the kind you didn't forget because forgetting it meant people died. The hiss of air escaping. Pressure releasing. Martinez's oxygen saturation climbed, 78, 82, 88, 92. The veins in his neck collapsed back toward normal. The trachea shifted back to center. Vitals stabilizing in 90 seconds. The door opened 7 minutes later. Dr. Marcus Ashford arrived with the code team, his face already arranged in the expression of a physician about to save a life, and what he found instead was a floor nurse with an MRE wrapper in her hands and a ranger's chest decompressing in real time and a clinical assessment that had nothing to do with watching television. "What the hell did you just do?" Ice in his voice. Not a question. An indictment. Ashley didn't look away from Martinez's monitor. Didn't wipe her hands. Didn't try to explain. Needle decompression for tension pneumothorax. Second intercostal space. He would have arrested in another minute and 40 seconds. Ashford's face darkened. Not red. Darker. Like something closing over. You performed a surgical procedure without physician oversight. Without any authorization. That's not a written warning, Nurse Cooper. That's grounds for immediate suspension pending an investigation. He pulled out his phone. Photographed the MRE wrapper. Documented the needle site. His hands were steady. His evidence collection was flawless. He was competent, methodical, and absolutely certain of what he'd just seen, not heroism, but insubordination. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't understand, was that he was standing in a room with someone who'd already survived worse than anything he could do to her. And that suspension was only the beginning. The monitor flatlined at 02 for 7 hours. Ashley was checking vitals on the 3rd floor when the alarm shrieked through the ICU. Not her patient. Not her responsibility. The suspension paperwork made that abundantly clear. She was restricted from surgical wing access, barred from touching any case Ashford considered his domain. But muscle memory doesn't read hospital policy. Her hands were moving before her brain caught up, muscle memory older than the scrub she wore, older than the fake nursing credentials that said Ashley Cooper, RN, Community College Portland, 2003. The code was Martinez. His oxygen sat had plummeted from 92 to 68 in 4 minutes. His neck veins distended like garden hoses, his chest barely rising. The resident on call, a kid named Chen, fresh out of his rotation, hands shaking as he fumbled with a blood pressure cuff, looked at the numbers and froze. The charge nurse called for Ashford. Nobody moved toward the patient. Ashley moved. She was through the doorway before anyone could stop her, before she could stop herself. The room smelled like copper and antiseptic and something else underneath, the specific metallic tang of a body shutting down. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. 78, 72, 68, 64. The numbers weren't moving in the right direction. Secondary puncture, she said. Not a question. Her voice didn't waver. Tension pneumothorax from the initial wound assessment. You're missing a second entry site, lower lobe. Listen to the breath sounds, left side is silent. Chen stared at her. The charge nurse froze. Nobody had authority to override the attending, and Ashford was 40 seconds away, moving through the corridors with the absolute certainty of a man who'd never had his orders questioned. Ashley didn't wait for him. She grabbed trauma shears from the code cart, her hand steady as surgical laser beams, and moved to the supply cabinet she'd organized 3 weeks earlier, the cabinet Ashford had no idea contained a treasure from her old life. In the bottom, tucked beneath sterile packaging, sat her go bag. Not the civilian one. The one with what she'd kept from Sanjin. Trauma shears. Needles. And 3 MRE wrappers she'd never thrown away because old soldiers never waste medical supplies they've improvised with before. Pain is data. Pain tells stories. And Martinez's chest was screaming. She tore open one of the silver emergency meal packets, the metallic wrapper crinkling between her palms, and fashioned a seal, 4 inches by 4 inches, folded 3 times, the exact thickness that would create an airtight barrier without suffocating the tissue beneath. She'd done this before. Not in a sterile American hospital under fluorescent lights. In a field hospital in Helmand province with mortar fire shaking the walls and a 6-year-old boy named Juanito bleeding out because a collapsed building didn't care about civilian protocol. Needle. 18 gauge minimum. Hand it to me, Chen. Not a request. It wasn't a question. The voice that came out of her throat was one she'd buried for 20 years, the voice that had commanded 214 Marines, that had called in airstrikes, that had ordered evacuation helicopters at 0300 hours in the Sanjin Valley where the rules were written in blood and the only law was whether the person next to you made it home. Chen handed her the needle. Ashley's hands moved with the precision of someone who'd inserted emergency thoracostomy tubes while helicopter blades rotated overhead, while radio static crackled urgent coordinates, while the weight of lives balanced on the space between her fingers. She found the second intercostal space, palpated for the landmarks, and pushed the needle between Martinez's ribs with the fluid certainty of 20 years of muscle memory. The hiss came immediately, the sound of pressure releasing, of a lung that could finally expand, of time spinning backward by 30 seconds. The oxygen saturation jumped. 72, 78. 82, 88. Climbing like a ladder. She placed the MRE wrapper seal over the wound, securing it with surgical tape from the cart, creating the temporary stabilization that would buy them time until a proper chest tube could be placed, until the surgical team could assess the full damage, until Martinez could stop dying on a Portland hospital bed because the attending was too busy protecting his ego to see what was right in front of him. The entire procedure took 98 seconds. That was when Dr. Marcus Ashford walked through the door. He saw her hands on Martinez's ribs. He saw the oxygen saturation climbing. He saw the improvised seal and the needle and the silver MRE wrapper that no resident under his supervision would ever think to use. He saw a competence that shouldn't exist in a floor nurse. He saw his authority being challenged. What he didn't see was the $10,000 Ranger School patch sewn into her jacket pocket. "Step back," Ashford said. Not a statement. A command. His voice carried the weight of 23 years of unquestioned dominance in this hospital, the tone of a man who'd never encountered resistance that held its ground. "You're removed from this case. Effective immediately." Ashley turned to face him. Her jaw tightened. Not trembling. Not shrinking. Just a single measured breath, then her voice came out flat and glacial. Pneumothorax missed on initial assessment. Secondary puncture, lower lobe. You would have caught it in 3 minutes. Patient would have been dead in 2. "I don't care if you saved his life," Ashford said, and the words hung in the air like poison gas, spreading through the ICU where nurses had stopped charting to watch, where residents pretended not to listen, where Martinez floated in medication-induced unconsciousness while the two of them circled each other like apex predators recognizing a threat. You had no authority to intervene. You had no certification for emergency thoracostomy procedures. You used hospital supplies without requisition. And you directly violated your restricted access notice. He stepped closer. His presence carried the weight of institutional power, the kind that comes from board connections and political capital and 23 years of people nodding instead of questioning. "Here's what happens now. I'm calling an emergency performance review. I'm documenting this as an authorized practice of medicine. And I'm recommending immediate termination for patient endangerment. Ashley didn't flinch. Didn't look away. The Martinez she'd saved in Sanjin had been 6 years old and conscious enough to scream. This one was medicated and silent. But the pressure was the same, someone bleeding out while the system failed them, while protocol mattered more than breathing. "Your choice, doctor," she said quietly. "Report that I saved a patient, or report that you would have let him die while protecting your schedule." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Ashford's face darkened, his jaw clenching, and he turned to the charge nurse with an authority that would reshape the entire hospital. Suspend her access to all surgical and ICU areas effective immediately. No patient contact. No chart access. She works admitting desk only, pending investigation. And call HR, I want a comprehensive background check on her credentials completed by end of business tomorrow. I want to know where a community college nurse learned trauma surgery. He left the room without looking back. The charge nurse wouldn't meet Ashley's eyes. Chen stared at his shoes. And in the bed between them, Martinez's oxygen saturation stayed at 91, rising slightly with each breath, climbing because she'd intervened, because she'd broken protocol, because a man who'd spent his life serving his country could still breathe. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened 72 hours later, when Ashford's administrative competence revealed itself as something far more strategic than simple retaliation. When he started moving pieces across the hospital like a chess master playing a game he'd already won. When he called the board members one by one and whispered questions about credential fraud. When he reassigned every tech who'd ever backed her up to different floors, isolating her shifts to the graveyard rotation, 300 to 1100 hours when oversight was minimal and mistakes most damaging. When he restricted her file with a flag for background investigation and sent HR down a path they didn't understand, triggering protocols that reached far deeper than any hospital system should reach. When he pulled a thread connected to things that were supposed to stay buried. The Pentagon protocols were already spinning up. The classified clearance was already alerting its handlers. And Dr. Marcus Ashford, moving with the precision of a man building a case so airtight that no lawyer could crack it, had just set something in motion that would arrive with helicopter rotors and federal credentials and the kind of authority that made hospital board presidents look like custodians. He didn't know what he'd triggered. He couldn't have known. But Ashley did. Ashford moved with the precision of a surgeon executing a planned procedure. Within 2 hours of watching Ashley complete that needle decompression, the procedure that should have been his, that should have established his authority over her incompetence, he'd already called an emergency performance review. The nursing director, Margaret Chen, sat across from him in his office with the uncomfortable posture of someone who understood she was about to be asked to do something she didn't want to do. I have documentation, Ashford said, sliding papers across his desk like dealing cards. Unauthorized patient assessment. Boundary violation. Use of non-standard equipment, an MRE wrapper, Margaret. An MRE wrapper as a medical device. That's not nursing. That's dangerous fantasy. Margaret's jaw tightened. She'd seen the O2 saturation climb from 68 to 88 in 90 seconds. She'd watched Martinez's color return. But Ashford's file was thicker, and his connections were older. And there's more, he continued, his voice dropping to the careful tone of someone sharing sensitive information. I've been quietly researching her background. Her references from before Oak Creek are vague. Military-adjacent language in her application. Knowledge of trauma patterns that a floor nurse shouldn't possess. I'm not saying she's fabricating credentials, but I'm saying the hospital needs to protect itself from liability. By noon, Ashley was removed from Martinez's care. By 1 o'clock, she'd been restricted from the surgical wing entirely. By 2 o'clock, Ashford had reassigned every member of her supporting staff to other floors, the respiratory therapist who knew her rhythms, the aide who anticipated her needs, the lab tech who prioritized her patient work. Her schedule was altered surgically, graveyard shifts isolated from the main nursing team, gaps of 12 hours between assignments, patterns designed to ensure she never built momentum or alliances. The call started in the afternoon. Ashford made them from his office with the door closed, his voice the practiced tone of a concerned colleague sharing information with board connections. Yes, concerning competency issues. No, nothing documented yet, but the pattern is troubling. Yes, I'd recommend verifying all her credentials thoroughly. Military background she doesn't discuss. Each conversation lasted exactly 6 minutes. Each one planted seeds that would take root. By 4 o'clock, the suspension hearing was scheduled for 8 the next morning. Ashley worked her final full shift in a hospital that had begun to feel like a hostile country. She moved through the corridors with the same efficiency she'd always maintained, but now every interaction carried weight. Colleagues who'd smiled stopped meeting her eyes. A resident she'd helped with a difficult intubation suddenly claimed he didn't remember her involvement. The break room cleared like a toxic spill when she entered, not from malice, but from the instinctive self-preservation of people who understood institutional power and didn't want to be standing next to someone drowning. Martinez asked for her twice. She couldn't respond to the page. The suspension hearing took place in a windowless conference room on the 3rd floor at 8 in the morning. Ashley sat alone on one side of a long table facing Ashford, Margaret Chen, 2 board representatives in business casual that cost more than Ashley's entire annual salary, and a human resources officer with the neutral expression of someone who'd done this before and knew exactly how it would end. Ashford presented his case with surgical precision. He showed documentation of the unauthorized procedure. He produced photos of the MRE wrapper Ashley had used, presented as evidence of dangerous improvisation rather than battlefield medicine. He cited the write-up from the patient room incident. He spoke about patterns of overstepping, boundary violations, the increasingly concerning implication that she possessed knowledge no floor nurse should possess. It suggests either credential fabrication, he said carefully, or something more troubling, that she's been hiding relevant professional experience. Military service, perhaps, that she's failed to disclose. The hospital's liability in that scenario is significant. Margaret looked at Ashley across the table. Her eyes asked a question. All you have to do is explain. Ashley folded her hands. She took a measured breath. She said nothing. Where did you learn battlefield trauma assessment? One of the board representatives asked. Your training records show standard nursing certification. Nothing that would explain your response to this patient's injuries. I cannot discuss that, Ashley said quietly. The words hung in the air like a confession. The decision was unanimous. 2 weeks unpaid suspension pending credential investigation. Possible termination upon conclusion of the review. The hospital reserved the right to contact external agencies regarding credential verification. Her badge was to be surrendered immediately. Access to all hospital systems was revoked effective now. Margaret didn't meet her eyes as Ashley turned in her ID badge and walked out of the conference room. The hospital laundry room was her last stop. The industrial washers hummed their monotonous rhythm, the dryers tumbling with the percussion of buttons and zippers and the ordinary detritus of a working hospital. Ashley pulled her scrubs from her locker one final time, the dark blue tops that still held the faint shape of her shoulders, the pants with the permanent crease at the knee from how she knelt beside beds, the compression socks that had protected her feet through 12-hour shifts. She folded them with precision. Hospital corners. Seams aligned. The same method she'd once used to fold her dress uniform in a barracks in Kandahar before a deployment. 20 years ago, a different woman in a different life had folded uniforms with this exact attention. Now that woman was folding scrubs, and the motion was identical, and the grief was identical, and nothing had changed except everything. The fabric still smelled faintly of antiseptic and the career she'd built from nothing after losing everything else. A career erased twice, once by the CIA, once by a man who'd never served a day in his life but understood institutional power well enough to destroy it anyway. She laid the folded scrubs on the metal shelf in her locker. Placed her ID badge on top, the plastic laminate reflecting the fluorescent lights, her civilian name a lie she'd worn for 20 years like body armor. In the pocket of her personal jacket, hanging on the hook beside the locker, she felt the outline of the combat badge. The one she'd pinned inside a 6-year-old boy's jacket in Sanjin before his refugee evacuation. The one that had been returned to her anonymously 5 years ago with a note reading only, "Thank you, Major." She'd kept it hidden. A talisman. Proof that the woman she'd been had existed, that those lives saved had been real, that someone remembered what her hands had been capable of. She closed the locker door. The click of the lock sounded like finality. But the background check that Ashford had so carefully orchestrated as part of his documentation campaign had triggered something neither of them expected. Routine personnel verification protocol. Standard third-party credential review. The kind of administrative process that runs automatically in hospital systems every 7 years, and Ashley's review had been flagged for expedited processing because of the investigation. The system searched federal databases. It found a classified security clearance buried under layers of CIA protection protocols, encrypted and compartmentalized, dormant for 20 years but never revoked. An automated alert pinged a Pentagon office at 1,647 hours. A junior officer looked at the flag and immediately escalated it to a secure line that connected to a military liaison office in Washington, D.C. 24 hours after finding Martinez's dog tag and combat badge, exactly as predicted in protocols written 20 years ago, the phone call Ashley never expected began routing through secure military channels. She would find out within the next 8 hours. The silence she'd kept for 2 decades would not hold much longer. In a parking lot at Oak Creek Memorial, watched by security cameras Ashford thought he controlled, a convoy of federal vehicles would arrive with passengers in dress uniforms. The quiet nurse who'd been running from a classified past would finally be found. But first, she drove home in silence, the combat badge heavy in her pocket, and waited for the phone to ring. The background check came back flagged. Not the routine kind that takes 3 weeks and delivers a clean slate. This one triggered something buried so deep in the Pentagon's classified servers that alarms started firing across 3 separate agencies within 4 hours of submission. Ashley didn't know yet. She was home, sitting on her apartment's balcony overlooking Portland's rain-slicked streets, the combat badge cold in her palm, when the first knock came at her door at 0600 hours. She didn't flinch. She'd been expecting something like this since the day she pulled Juanito Martinez from that collapsed building in San Gin 20 years ago. Muscle memory took over, door chain secured, visual confirmation through the peephole, then the slow measured opening. The man in the doorway was stone-faced in a way that only came from decades of classified briefings. Navy dress blues. Colonel's insignia. Behind him stood another figure in civilian clothes, FBI credentials already visible on the breast pocket like a weapon at rest. They didn't introduce themselves immediately. They handed her a manila folder sealed with red tape and the words classified, restore upon clearance verification. The silence in her apartment stretched like taut wire. Ashley opened the folder with steady hands. Page 1. Silver star. Her chest compressed like a fist closing. The citation read like someone else's life, for gallantry in action above and beyond the call of duty. Major Ashley Marie Cooper demonstrated extraordinary courage during hostile operations in San Gin Province, Helmand Region, Afghanistan, 2004 to 2006. She turned the page without a sound. Bronze Star. Another Bronze Star. Each one commemorated moments she'd spent 20 years trying to forget, moments when her hands had moved without permission from her conscious mind, when she'd made decisions that meant people lived or died. The Navy SEAL commander who'd come with the liaison stepped forward. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd watched her service record restored from classified obscurity. You saved 43 lives during your embedded tour with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. 43 documented cases. That doesn't count the ones who live because you trained their combat medics, because you established field protocols they used for the next 10 years. He paused. You pulled a 6-year-old boy from a collapsed building on September 14, 2005. He was bleeding out. You pinned your own combat badge inside his jacket before his refugee evacuation. Told his family you'd saved a ranger. You meant it, you knew he'd be a ranger before he was old enough to walk. Ashley's jaw tightened. Not trembling. Restraint. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The FBI agent stepped forward, her voice crisp as starched uniform. The CIA operation you witnessed in San Gin has been declassified as of 24 hours ago. the operation that caused your military records to be scrubbed, the one that required you to disappear into civilian life, to become someone who officially did not exist, that classification has been lifted. You are Major Ashley Marie Cooper again. You have been since the moment that security clearance flag triggered our protocols. Behind them, through the apartment window, the Portland rain had started coming down harder. The sound of it hammering against the glass was like the rotor wash from a helicopter that had never actually landed. Ashley set the folder down on her coffee table. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. How long have you known? The SEAL commander's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, respect recognizing respect. Since you decompressed Martinez's chest at 02 for 7 hours using battlefield medicine that shouldn't exist in a civilian nurse's hands. Since Dr. Ashford started documenting your unauthorized procedures without understanding he was filing complaints against a decorated major. The FBI agent added, his background check request on you was the trigger. He wanted to prove credential fraud. Instead, he activated a Pentagon protocol designed to protect service members under classified protection. Dr. Ashford didn't know what he was hunting. The words hung in the air like blood in still water. At Oak Creek Memorial, exactly 4.7 miles south of her apartment, something was unraveling that Dr. Ashford couldn't see coming. He was in his office when the hospital board director arrived with 2 security officers and a request, more of a command, that he surrender his hospital credentials pending a full review of his patient assessment protocols. Specifically regarding Army Ranger Jonathan Martinez. The director's voice carried new coldness. Your initial trauma assessment missed a secondary pneumothorax that nearly proved fatal. A floor nurse, she paused, and in that pause lived every ounce of professional shame. A nurse named Ashley Cooper recognized the injury pattern and performed a needle decompression that saved his life. We're reviewing whether your assessment constituted gross negligence. Ashford's face went pale. He reached for explanation, but the security officers were already making it clear he could leave his credentials in the office or they would be taken. His hands shook as he placed his hospital ID and surgical privileges on the desk. Still competent enough to understand what was happening. Still intelligent enough to see the walls closing in. By midnight, 3 separate investigations had opened. The hospital board demanded his files. The state medical board announced a review of his patient outcomes for the past 5 years. Federal investigators, quiet ones, the kind who asked questions without raising their voices, wanted to interview him about his personnel actions against a service member under classified protection. The quiet was worse than if they'd yelled. At 2,200 hours, Ashford made his fatal mistake. Desperation tastes like copper. Like the tang of blood when you bite the inside of your mouth trying not to scream. He used his administrative credentials to access the hospital security system, one last competent move, calculated and precise. Delete the footage from Martinez's initial assessment. Delete the evidence of his negligence. Delete the proof that he'd missed obvious signs of secondary trauma. The deletion command entered at 2,214 hours, his hands moving with the precision of a surgeon performing a life-saving operation. Except this wasn't saving anything. This was ending everything. What Ashford didn't know was that James Chen, the hospital's IT administrator, had served 2 combat tours in Helmand Province as a Marine. Chen understood security in the way only a person who'd survived ambushes could understand it. His cloud backup protocols ran automatically on every medical area camera feed. His system flagged the deletion attempt and alerted him in real time. Chen watched through his administrative console as Ashford erased frame after frame of video evidence, watched his hand shake, watched the competence fracture into panic. At 2,230 hours, Chen made 2 phone calls. One to the state medical board reporting evidence destruction during an active investigation. One to the FBI agent still standing in the hospital corridor with the Navy SEAL commander, reporting potential obstruction of a federal inquiry. The agent listened for exactly 8 seconds, then thanked Chen with the kind of gratitude reserved for the people who stop catastrophes quietly. By midnight, Dr. Marcus Ashford had 3 open investigations. Hospital Board Review for gross negligence in patient care. Medical Board Review for deliberate evidence tampering. FBI interview request for his role in targeting a service member under federal protection. His competence had become the rope. Every strategic move he'd made against Ashley was reframed as deliberate persecution of a decorated combat veteran. Every careful administrative maneuver now looked like calculated malice. The investigation would take weeks. The legal proceedings would take months. But 6 months from that night, on a Tuesday afternoon when Portland sunlight streamed through the lobby windows of Oak Creek Memorial like benediction, Ashley Cooper returned to her hospital. Not as the floor nurse. Not as the invisible woman who cleaned wounds and said sorry to condescending surgeons. As a consulting trauma specialist. Her military service record fully restored. Her decorations framed in the emergency department. The combat badge pinned to her professional jacket, warm against her chest where it belonged. She signed in at the visitor's desk. The security guard checking her ID was Dr. Marcus Ashford. His hands trembled slightly as he verified her credentials. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. He wore the navy blue uniform of night security, his white coat gone, his surgical privileges terminated, his medical license suspended pending investigation conclusion. The medical board had found gross negligence. The hospital had found evidence tampering. The FBI had found sufficient cause for federal inquiry. No criminal charges, but his career in medicine was a closed file. Ashley met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds as she passed the desk. Not smiling. Not gloating. Simply acknowledging the man who tried to destroy her with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained through every public humiliation. She nodded once and kept walking. In the atrium, Martinez stood in his dress army uniform, fully recovered, preparing to return to active duty. When Ashley entered, he saluted, not casual, but the formal salute reserved for officers who'd earned blood respect. She returned it with muscle memory that made every veteran in the crowd understand what they were witnessing. Something that transcended rank and uniform and the small institutional power games that consumed ordinary lives. Martinez pinned a second Ranger tab on her lapel, next to the combat badge. The room erupted in applause that sounded like thunder refusing to stop. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. This was your reminder to like this video if you believe in second chances and justice served by the quiet ones. Subscribe to see what happens when the truth finally catches up with liars. And comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to?